Hello, I'm Jane Bailey Bain, and I'm here to talk to you today about stories and how we use them to make sense of our lives. Because you are all natural-born storytellers. You tell stories all the time, chatting with friends, phoning your family, talking with colleagues. You tell stories about what's happened to you. Now, the subject of your stories is obviously true, but the way you interpret it is subjective. You choose what will be important in the story of your life. So when you meet someone, you say to them, "What have you been doing?" Strangers on a train, friends in a cafe, "What have you been up to?" The answer is always a story. Because they are quite simply the most effective way of getting information across. Stories show us how one thing led to another. When you tell a story, you make a causal sequence of events. A happened, and so B happened. You make a connection in your mind and in the mind of your listener. And that's what a story is. Stories also let us imagine alternative ways of being. This is the way things are, but perhaps they could be different. When you tell stories, you're exploring with the material of your life. You're portraying a particular image of yourself to the people that you're talking to. And sometimes stories let you see how you could go forward in a way that's totally new. Why are stories so powerful? Well, scientists have shown that they operate on our brains. When you hear a story, your brain lights up in the same way as if you were actually experiencing those things. So when the hero of your story eats a spicy curry, you can actually taste it on your tongue because your sensory cortex has lighted up too. And when the heroine karate chops a monster, well, your motor cortex fires up as well. So when you tell a story, you are quite literally empathizing, synchronizing minds with your listener. And this means that you can share experiences. You see, we're programmed to see patterns in things. There's actually a word for this, pareidolia. It's when you see a face in the clouds, or a pattern in the tea leaves in your cup, or figures dancing in a fire in the fireplace. We see patterns wherever we go. We make sense of events. We see how one thing led to another. When you touch a hot kettle, ow, it hurt your hand. You make a causal connection between touching the kettle and your hand hurting, and so you don't do it again. And there's a very good evolutionary reason for this. You've heard of a Stone Age diet. Long ago our ancestors were hunter-gatherers and they lived on mostly fruit and nuts and a bit of protein from time to time, mostly eggs. Well, if you eat a diet like that today with not too much wheat, not too much dairy, you feel healthier. In the same way, our brains evolved so that we could learn from stories. There's a survival advantage to being able to empathize with other human beings. When you hear a story and you get that experience, then you don't actually have to risk the danger yourself. So you can learn without actually having to suffer what your storyteller went through. And what's more, stories can actually alter your brain chemistry too. A researcher called Dr. Paul Zak has found that when you hear stories, your brains release cortisol and oxytocin. Cortisol is the stress hormone that gives you a fight or flight response. Oxytocin is the bonding hormone, the one that makes you feel warm and cuddly when you're close to people. Not surprisingly, Dr. Zak is known as Dr. Love to his colleagues. So stories can actually change the way that your brains produce chemicals and thereby program you to be more receptive to stories like that in the future. This research has very, very far-reaching implications because if we can share experiences like this, if we can share emotions, then stories are perhaps the most important thing about us. The word humane is what I'd like you to think about here. Humane means sympathetic, able to empathise with other people. So you could say that the ability to empathise, the ability to be sympathetic, the ability to be humane is what makes us truly human. I think it's no exaggeration to say that storytelling is the most important aspect of our humanity. If stories are so important for communicating with other people, just think how important they must be for communicating with yourself. It's one thing to tell stories to an audience, but when you listen to the stories that you're telling, you take on board the truths in those stories. You become the character that you portray. Stories are very, very powerful implements. Stories help you see important things in your life, and when you're interpreting your life, you're probably using stories that you've heard in childhood to help you make sense of things. And those stories will have key characters, and they'll also have various plot lines. So when you hear a story, you're probably drawing on the fairy tales, the myths and the legends that you heard in childhood in order to construct your own story, the story of your own lives that have survived the test of time. They're tales that have lasted generation after generation. You see, stories are very Darwinian. A story is only successful if it survives to be replicated in someone else's mind. So if you hear a story that I tell you, and then you repeat that story to someone else, that story is successful. That story has survived to be told to someone else. And that is the key test of a good story. Of course, sometimes stories aren't appropriate for the modern world. A girl just can't wait for her prince to come. But other stories resonate with deep, deep psychic truths. The monsters that you might be fighting now are metaphorical, not actual fire-breathing dragons. But they're nonetheless real for all that. Now, to tell a story, you obviously need to have characters. And the same characters appear in stories from different times and places around the world. You recognise them when you see them. The hero, the good mother, the wise one, the trickster. These characters are very, very familiar from stories from your childhood. And when you hear of one of these characters in a story, you instantly know what they're probably going to be like. This is because they're based on instinctive patterns that arise in our minds. What Jung called archetypes. These are outline forms that just seem to be spontaneous in the human psyche. You fill them in on the basis of your personal, individual experience. So your image of a good mother will be coloured by your own experience of mothering. Your idea of how an ogre behaves is affected by stories that you've heard when you were very young. These archetypal figures, of course, you then start to project onto other people in your life. You'll see someone as being a trickster or a bit of a witch. And sometimes this results in us projecting stereotypes onto people. It's very, very important to be aware of this. When you feel yourself making assumptions about the way that someone else is, you're projecting an archetypal figure onto them. You're making a stereotypical character for that person, which may, but probably doesn't, reflect them in real life. The archetypes persist, though, in modern books, in modern films, in modern stories. So Cinderella, for example, is the oldest story in the world. There's an Egyptian version called The Rose-Red Slipper. There's even a version from ancient China. But it's also retold in films like Pretty Woman. Or Pride and Prejudice, that's more of a clever girl story. So you have these ancient stories being retold again and again and again. There's basically 12 archetypal figures divided into masculine and feminine energies, light and dark, good and bad, young, mature, middle-aged. And these figures are the ones that all other characters are based on. Now, it's very, very important to emphasize that all of the archetypes are potentially present in each one of us. So when I talk about masculine and feminine energies, obviously a man can nurse a friend. A woman can be an ogre when she needs to get something done. Even more importantly, the light and the dark are present within each of us. And this is something that is very, very important to acknowledge. The ancient Greeks talked about this when they looked at the story of Dionysus, the Greek god of wine. Dionysus is a son of Zeus, a wild, anarchic figure, born with horns on his head. His followers were satyrs, half man, half goat, and wild women called maenads who danced in an ecstatic frenzy. Not surprisingly, people who didn't partake in the mysteries of wine drinking found all of this quite threatening, and he wasn't welcomed wherever he went. When Dionysus and his followers came to Thebes, many people came out to join in the festivities, and King Pentheus was horrified. He tried to ban this crazy new cult. When his informants failed to tell him what he wanted to know, he decided to creep out himself and spy upon the festivities, little knowing that his own mother, Agave, was in fact a convert. He climbed a tree in a clearing and looked down upon the followers below, and when the maenads spotted him, they chased after him and tore him to pieces with their own hands. What this tells us is that you don't have to worship every god, but you do have to honour the different parts of yourself, to acknowledge that the dark forces are powerful, because if you acknowledge them, if you respect them, then you can integrate what you need to know. But if you don't, those dark powers will overcome you. Another analogy is with light. If you want to see yourself as a good person, a light character, you might think of white light. White light isn't the absence of all colour. White light is made of all the colours put together. And so if you want to be a truly good person, you must acknowledge all the emotions in yourself, and only by doing this can you become compassionate. Only by acknowledging everything inside you can you truly understand the condition of humanity. Now, sometimes you might want to retell your own story. We've said stories are very, very powerful weapons, very, very powerful ways of communicating, and very, very powerful ways of affecting yourself. So one of the things that you might want to consider doing is working on your own story. Think of something that happened in the past, and then think how you can recast those characters. So if there was an occasion in your past when you were upset about something, if you were suffering about something, think about how you could reinterpret the people in the story. I've developed a 5-finger mnemonic in my book Storyworks, which is relevant to constructing your own story. And the steps are this. First of all, think of the incident and how you were at that time, what it felt like when this incident occurred. Next, think of the characters who were in that story and how it affected you. And then, thirdly, recast the characters and tell the story again in a different way. So possibly your mother wasn't mean and weak, she was just feeling insecure. Possibly that teacher at school wasn't being kind, he was actually being rather creepy. Yeah? Then when you've done that, tell the story again to yourself in this new way and see how it makes you feel. And last of all, fifthly, go forward to the future. Now that you've reinterpreted your story, think about the new character that you've developed for yourself and how you can fix that in your mind. Maybe a garment or a piece of jewellery or something that reminds you of how you want to feel now about that time in the past. This is a very, very powerful way in which you can reframe your own story. So, I hope you like stories, because they are the most important thing in our world. Stories are really what it takes for us to be fully human. Life has to be lived forwards, but read backwards. Sometimes we can only see what was going on when we view the tale in retrospect. So what I would like you to take away from the talk today is that as you go forward, it's possible to retell your story, to reframe your story in a way that helps you make more sense of your life. I'm just going to talk a little bit about these two books. Life Works is all about the archetypal figures and how they manifest in stories from different times and places around the world. And it gives examples of all the archetypal figures in books and plays and films, and also has examples of each story. And Storyworks has even more stories. Storyworks has over 70 stories from all around the world, but it also tells you how to frame a story using that 5-step process that I was discussing earlier. I'm sure you've got lots of questions, so let's throw the floor open. Who's got something to ask? Oh, come on, someone. Yes.
Well, you were talking about your archetypal figures and the stories, but then when you were talking about the light and the dark, I didn't really know what you were talking about.
Okay. The figures that occur in stories from different times and places around the world all have these common characters, the archetypal figures. Yeah. And basically, archetypes can be condensed to 12 basic types. So you have the young figures, the mature figures, and the old or wise figures. Within those 3 categories, we subdivide them into masculine energies and feminine energies, which tend to be more outer focused and more inner focused. And within those, you have light and dark aspects of each one, which might conventionally have been seen as good and bad, but of course they're much, much more subtle than that. They're what you might call positive energies and negative energies. So, for example, many women are pushed into the role of carer, and they become teachers or nurses or mothers. And women are rewarded socially for taking on those roles. But conversely, women need to express themselves, to enjoy life, to live life to the full, to run with the wolves. And so the converse of the good mother is the wild woman, the woman who lives life because life is there to be lived. Now, some people might be critical of that. Back in your box, girl. But of course, both aspects of femininity are absolutely key if you're going to be a fulfilled person. Jung actually said at one point, would you rather be whole or good? We don't actually need social approval all the time. Sometimes being whole is more important.
And in fact, those things can operate every hour of the day.
Absolutely. And of course, let's give an example using the male hero as opposed to the trickster. So men are often pushed into being hero figures. You're expected to behave in socially acceptable ways, giving up seats on tubes and, fixing electrical problems at home and so on. Men are expected to rise to the occasion. But sometimes being a hero is very, very inconvenient. In fact, sometimes standing up to the world results in getting knocked down. So sometimes that light energy isn't necessarily the best way to behave. Sometimes you're better off using life jujitsu and being a bit of a trickster. So if someone goes for you, then step out of the way. Let the force of their own blow take them past you. Be a trickster. Be a little bit cunning. It's perfectly legitimate, and it might actually get where you need to go a lot faster than trying to be a conventional hero. That's what I mean by the light and the dark aspects. One is socially acceptable. One is seen as being a little bit cunning or wild or sneaky. But actually, they're both very, very effective ways of operating in the world, and you should incorporate both those aspects within yourself.
So suppress it in some way.
Indeed, our natural inclination is very often to reject the dark side and to pretend it doesn't exist within ourselves, when in fact, of course, it's a very, very important aspect of who you are, and even more important, how to be effective, how to live fully as a human being. You feel that you don't want to look at the dark side of yourself, and you're calling it evil. What I'm saying here is that actually the dark side isn't evil. It's another way of being. So if, for example, you have strong ecological beliefs, there may be occasions when you need actually to be a bit of an ogre to get other people to take those beliefs on board and to act appropriately. It's no good just being wise and going, you know, if we all keep using plastic bags, the oceans are going to fill with plastic and the dolphins will suffocate. It doesn't do any good. Sometimes you've just got to say, no, we're going to enact legislation that says that people will be fined if they drop litter on the pavement. So you can't always be nice, you can't always be wise, you can't always be reasoning. In a good cause, sometimes you've got to unleash that slightly more forceful energy, which is what I'm calling the dark side, in order to actually achieve an aim that you think is good. Does that make sense? Depression, it does not mean evil. It means the counterpart of light. It's an essential part of life. Just as in yin and yang, you have the dark and the light elements joined together with the white eye in the dark and the dark eye in the white. You have to choose names to describe opposites. And I'm deliberately not using good and bad because they're not. I don't think dark is bad. There's a lot of cultural weight ascribed here. A lot of cultural weight here. We have to be very, very careful. But obviously within our society there have been all sorts of connotations of white and black, light and dark, and it's helpful, I think, for us to examine those and become aware of them, but equally to take on board the fact that sometimes we do need to acknowledge those energies within ourselves. Otherwise they will overcome us, they will destroy us. So in a sense, I'm not afraid of the negative connotations of dark. I would rather that people learnt not to be afraid of them and to integrate themselves more fully, to accept that those emotions, those feelings, those modes of behaviour. Do I think that there are more negative female archetypes than male? No, I think that there are an even number because they are counterparts of each other. So you have the wicked witch, you have the ogre. Our dark archetypes are more socially acceptable if they have the masculine energies. And as I keep saying, all of the archetypes are inside all of us. I think it's an interesting point, and this makes it all the more important for women to take on board the power of the archetypes. So, for example, the young dark male archetype I call the urchin. The young dark female archetype is the clever girl. And yes, the urchin is often regarded rather fondly, whilst the clever girl is socially unacceptable. So yes, there is an element in which we have to choose our social goals in ways that will facilitate our existence. But equally, it's very important to acknowledge to yourself what the emotions are inside, what the motives are, what the various archetypal roles are that you're acting out. And it's very empowering to be able to take these on board and to step into a different persona. Exactly. What you do is you actually recast the characters, and this is where you can draw on archetypal figures in a very, very positive way. So if, for example, I have to be very careful here because people have different things in their background, but supposing somebody had an experience where a teacher at school took advantage of them and they tried to complain to their parents, but their parents never responded to help them, and they always felt slightly guilty, because people often do feel guilty when things have been done to them. You can completely recast that, because actually instead of saying the teacher behaved in a way that was borderline but the child allowed it and the parents let them down, let's recast this altogether. That teacher at school was bad. They were an ogre. The mother was not disregarding the plea for help. She was weak, she was insecure, she could not be a good mother because she herself was feeling like a child in this situation. And as for you, the person who was suffering, well, far from being a victim, you were a survivor. You were very young, there was nothing else you could have done, but goodness, you managed to make it through despite these characters, despite this ogre figure and this weak parent figure. You survived. That's a very empowering thing to know about yourself, that you made it through even at that age.
So it's the actual characters that you're redrawing?
Yes, you are redrawing the characters. You're recasting the story.
Yeah.
The events, as you remember them, are going to stay the same, but you are recasting the characters so that you can see that far from being a victim of bullying or theft or whatever it was, that you were actually able to survive very, very adverse circumstances. And that's something to be proud of, and that's something that we can all learn from.
And you're less likely to blame the other people involved, perhaps?
Well, you're certainly less likely to blame yourself, and since that's all that you can ever work on, that's a very key stage to be at.
Yeah. Sorry, what's the process of recasting? How do you select people or events, and then how do you actually tease it out?
Well, think of an event that happened to you, and it helps to write it down. It always helps to actually do this as a written exercise. So think of what's the event that happened early in your life, think of who else was involved and what their characteristics were, and then the important step, quite literally, recast it, looking at the archetypal figures. So describe each character differently. They're still the same person, but you're giving them a different archetypal role.
How do you choose what those kind of new masks or costumes?
That's up to you. That's up to you. So it helps if you have the table of archetypal figures, because I've obviously developed this table. Jung just mentioned a few of them, and I've developed 12. 12 is all you need. You don't need a pantheon of, off the peg for any occasion archetypes. All you need is these 12 basic ones that you then modify according to the light of your experience. You will put features on them and so on. So you literally give a different role name to each character. And then when you tell the story again, you can see it very differently. Yeah? So instead of the teacher being a wise authority figure, you can perceive them as an ogre who was actually taking advantage of where they were.
So that's quite empowering, ultimately.
It's very empowering. It's very empowering because it enables you to write your story in a way that shows that you've made it through to where you are now.
And your story, it changes your story going forward then as well.
And this changes your story going forward, absolutely. Once you see how you feel about it now, you can then alter how you behave in the future, and you can become a new person. This is a huge area. Should we take stories and seek revenge? Are we entitled to do that? Is there a God within us that puts us in a position where we can take revenge? These are huge issues. So basically, I think this is one to take offline. Yeah, it's a massive, massive area. I'm not suggesting that you take revenge into your own hands. Yeah, I'm talking about the story that you weave for yourself being one that makes you feel better, being empowering. As the saying goes, you don't need to get revenge, just let karma do the work for you. So what we're talking about here is empowering you to move forward in a better way in the world in the future. It's not denying what's happened, but it's casting your story in such a way that it helps you rather than hinders you. On a very, very simple level, if you run for the bus in the morning and the driver sees you coming and, as far as you can tell, deliberately closes the door and drives off, leaving you in the rain, you can either fume about that all morning, or when you arrive in work, half an hour late, you can make it into a really funny story, which is going to make you feel better, which is going to make your day turn out more productive. So it's about using stories in such a way that it helps you. Yeah? It's taking something that you do anyway and letting yourself benefit from it. Yes, stories work very much at the level of the mind, but the mind affects the body and the spirit. And so by working with material in the minds, you can change how you physically feel, which is part of what it is to be incarnate. And you can also change your spiritual conception of the world. And so this is why it's very important to be aware of the stories that you tell to yourself, as well as the stories that you tell to other people, because they have these very, very real effects upon us. Absolutely. If you can change the story that you tell yourself, you can actually change your life. You can actually change the way you interact with the world.
Do you know that people have done it successfully?
All the time. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Do you think the concept of the wild woman is to help people to do that, to interact with that universe?
I think the concept of the wild woman is a very important concept. Yes.
Could you explain it?
I think one of the best ways to explain it would be to refer to the story of the Selkie, which is one of the stories in Storyworks, which relates how one of the seal women up in Scotland, the seal women of course come to dance on the beaches by the light of the full moon, and the fishermen in Scotland know about this, and there are many, many tales of Selkies, and one of them tells how a young fisherman went to spy on these girls dancing on the beach, and he crept along the edge of the rocks until he got to where the sealskins lay, and he pulled one of them in and tucked it under his arm. And when the girls saw him, they all screamed and ran and took their sealskins and dived back into the water, but of course one of them couldn't. She was stuck on the beach, and he put his arms around her and told her that he wanted to marry her, and he took her home because she couldn't get away again without her sealskin. And she went home with him, and over the days and weeks and months that followed, they seemed to become very fond of each other, and in the end he married her, and they had 2 wee bairns, and they lived together as man and wife for many, many years, and he kept the sealskin under lock and key in a huge wooden chest in their house. But one day they were late for church. The children were out playing, and they ran off for church with their Sunday best on, and they were halfway down the path when she made some excuse and turned back home again. Well, the man and the children were all the way at the kirk before he put his hand in his pocket and felt, the key wasn't there. He ran all the way home, but too late. She was gone. But she loved her children, and every Easter Sunday when the church bells ring, if you look out into the bay, you can see a seal out there bobbing up and down. It's the Selkie, come to see that her children are being cared for. Well, a lot of women hit grown-up life, when you stop being a girl and you've got to take on the responsibilities of adulthood. And we take it very seriously, and it can be quite constraining. The trick is, always remember where you've kept your sealskin, so that you can go and play whenever you want to.